Film and Whiskey Nation, do you ever think about awards? Of course you do. You drink whiskey and watch movies, which means that you know that nothing is validated until a group of random people say, hey, we love what you're doing. The awesome thing about Doc Swinson's whiskey is that it isn't just some group of schlubs that are giving them awards. They have been winning attention from some of the most important whiskey experts that you can imagine. They've been voted best distillery in Washington State by the New York International Spirits Competition. They've been voted the best independent bottler by the Ascot Awards, as well as the best finished bourbon from the Ascot Awards for their La Menta Exploratory Cask. Their Exploratory Cask series is where they release some of the most fascinating and adventurous experiments. If you're ever checking out Doc's lineup and see a white label, there's a really good chance that that's the only time you'll see that bottle, so make sure you snatch it up. Doc Swinson's has been offering just phenomenal finished and blended whiskeys for quite some time now. You can find them online at docswhiskey.com. That's DOCS whiskey.com. In 1986, director James Cameron and star Sigourney Weaver gave the world an action-packed sequel that nearly sucks your face off.
In 2022, we take a trip to Virginia to try a uniquely distilled whiskey.
The film is Aliens.
The whiskey is John J. Bowman Single Barrel.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at James Cameron's 1986 sci-fi, horror, action masterpiece, Aliens. I'm not going to lie, Brad, I had this kind of circled on the schedule this year because this movie just goes so freaking hard, dude. Like, I don't know. I will probably sound more like a bro today than I've ever sounded in the history of our podcast because there is something that's just purely, this movie's like pure adrenaline and it works. And it's just like, I have no notes. I have no complaints. I'm just going to sit here for the next hour and bask in the glory of Jim Cameron's direction.
Yeah, I mean, he just takes the first movie and turns it into an action thriller, and it's perfect.
Yeah.
And I love everything about it.
You know, after this week, we're going to watch Terminator and Terminator 2. James Cameron is a master at sequels. It's just something that he's really good at developing themes, but also turning, you know, like, I don't want to say subverting. I hate when people use that word, but kind of turning things on their head a little bit. And we might as well start off talking about the obvious differences between this movie and 1979's Alien, a film that we have done on the show before. Brad, I assume you have not revisited Alien since we watched it a couple years ago.
I have not, no.
Do you remember at least the sort of general vibe and rhythm of that movie? I mean,
yeah.
that was a very, I don't want to say straightforward horror movie because it's very high-end sci-fi too. Like they crash, they find that empty spaceship with the gigantic dead alien skeleton in it. They're like, what the hell's going on? And then the xenomorphs happen. And there's a ton of like, I don't know, unspoken mythology going on in the Alien universe that never really gets expanded on until Ridley Scott comes back and does his sequels, you know, in the 2000s. But in this movie,
until Prometheus,
right,
when they answer all the questions nobody was asking.
I am not a fan of Prometheus. I know a lot of people like think it's a sci-fi masterpiece, but I am much more in the Jim Cameron like fold because what he did was he said, you know what? Somebody gave me a suggestion. Like literally, if you go on this movie's Wikipedia page, it says that he wrote a 40-something page treatment for this movie based on the suggestion Ripley and soldiers. That was like the whole theme of the movie. And that's what Jim Cameron was like, yes. He went off and wrote the treatment for this movie. And by God, he did it, man. This movie is freaking great. And this is exactly what a sequel to a movie like Alien should be.
Yeah, I mean, he takes the theme of a horror film, he tweaks it a little bit, he adds a little bit of combat and action, And yet you still have the elements of horror and fear just rippling throughout this movie. And I think we need to get into Brad Explains before we just completely dive in on this.
All right, well, then let's go ahead and do a quick segue into Brad Explains, America's favorite segment of our show. This is where Brad breaks down the plot of the film that he has just seen, often for the first time. Brad, was this your first time checking out Aliens?
It sure was, Robert.
All right, so what we do here is we put 60 seconds on the clock. Brad has to break down the plot of the film. You know, it's a simple plot, but there's also a lot that happens in this movie, so I'm interested to hear where you go with your 1 minute of time. Brad, go.
Officer Ripley awakens after 57 years in cryosleep, and she finds out that there's a colony where they had originally picked up the alien that killed all of her fellow crew members. The colonizing company loses contact with the colony, so they send Ripley and a squad of Marines to go investigate. Obviously, the aliens have taken over the colony, and they have to fight for their survival to escape from the planet, hopefully destroying the aliens in the process.
Boom.
Boom. Oh, literally. Atomic boom.
Atomic boom. Man, I don't even know where to start with this movie. And I'm trying to think of where the best place would be. And I think maybe it's to talk about the writing of this film. Because we will be developing a theme here that James Cameron is not known for his dialogue writing. And I think, once again, like the dialogue in this movie is not especially great, but everything about this movie is so curt and matter-of-fact and to the point that I feel like the dialogue works a lot better here than it does in a movie like Avatar, where you're trying to build out sort of fantasy elements. This movie is very much just like military people barking orders at each other and people trying not to get found by aliens, so they're speaking in short sentences. And I really thought the dialogue here works, you know, for the most part at least.
Yeah, and you get to see Sigourney Weaver fleshed out as a character a little more. I enjoy the way that they bring back certain elements from the first movie. The AI in this film I thought was really well acted. Mm-hmm. And honestly, out of all the sci-fi films I've ever seen, I really love the way that Cameron uses AI. I think that he just has a really... They hold a really unique position, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, the great thing about this script, Brad, is the way that this movie is structured. Because, you know, it's slightly over 2 hours. It's about 2 hours and 15 minutes. And you do not see an alien in this movie until the 1 hour mark. Like, there is a long build-up to the aliens. I wouldn't say that this movie is ever slow-paced or boring. There's just a ton of background that Cameron is trying to build to. And he's fleshing out the character of Ripley. He's introducing you to the evils of this corporation. He's introducing you to this small platoon that she's going to be dropped in with. And they really do a great job of building the suspense because having watched the first Alien, you come into this movie expecting lots of alien kills and you're not getting any for an hour. And then all of a sudden it's like, hey, what if we had 100 aliens? I just love the idea of somebody being like, James Cameron, what's the solution here? We're stuck. We had a great movie about an alien. And he's like, no. I got it. Aliens.
Plural. We need a plurality
and they're
of
like,
aliens.
Oh, okay. 2 aliens? And he's just like, more. Like they just keep talking him up, right? But you see this colony of aliens. And Cameron does this great thing where, you know, you're now going into the aliens' territory, whereas the first movie is about an alien kind of invading somebody else's territory. Now you've got this crew going into the bowels of an alien hive. And it's so cool how his mind thinks about how the eggs are laid and everything else. But, you know, obviously we'll get to all that. I guess I just want to hear your thoughts, Brad, on the way this movie is structured. The build up to that big payoff. I think that there's like a ton of things that people have ripped off from this movie since then in terms of like slow build. And then like the last hour is pretty much nonstop action and horror. And there's false endings. It keeps you going until the very last second. And I think it all comes back to Cameron's really strong ability to know exactly how tense things need to be. Like, he really feels like he is orchestrating and conducting this kind of thing to make sure that the rhythm keeps pace.
I think that's the key to this film, Bob, is the rhythm. You never are allowed to rest and relax. And even at the start of the film, 5 minutes in, you have Ripley having a nightmare of the alien bursting from her own belly. And it's just enough action to like kind of put you on the edge of your seat, and you're never really able to find your way back from there. I think that Paul Reiser does an incredible job. He has such a beautiful mannerism about him that he's so soft and gentle and kind that you never fully see it coming how evil he is going to be. And I think that the dialogue between he and Sigourney Weaver near the start of the movie and throughout the middle, I think that they really carry this film in a lot of the ways, as a lot of the Marines are just being bros and doing ridiculous Marine things, if you will.
I'm glad you brought up Paul Reiser, and it's really funny that we brought up Paul Reiser before we brought up Sigourney Weaver, but if there's anyone in this cast who steals scenes away from Sigourney Weaver that isn't an alien, it's Paul Reiser. He does such a good job of, and by the time they kind of find out that he is as evil as he actually is, and they have him cornered and they're about to shoot him, and he's just like, oh, this is ridiculous, and he does such a great job of embodying a guy who can't even convincingly talk his way out of being about to get shot. You know what I mean? Like, he is just sleazy, and she calls him sleazy. And he doesn't come across as the sleazy businessman because he's so much smarter and so much more underhanded than that. I thought he did a phenomenal job in this movie.
Yeah. And really, he and Sigourney Weaver are the reason this movie works. And I think it's why you look at a lot of the later Aliens movies, they're just not quite as good. And that's me just solely basing it on IMDb ratings and what I've heard from my friends. But you have here two actors who know exactly what they're going for in the role. And for me, they just had really sincere performances. And, Paul Reiser is awesome. Sigourney Weaver is incredible.
Next level,
Bob.
dude. Next level.
I mean, genuinely, I would say she has one of the best performances of anyone this whole season in a 80s sci-fi movie.
Well, and that's the thing, too, is you look at her character in Alien, right? She is... I can't remember exactly what her role is in the crew in the movie Alien, but she's not one of them, right? She's like a consultant or something. And she ends up being like the horror movie last girl.
Yeah.
That's kind of who she is. And she does a great job at it. And she outsmarts the alien and she kicks a little bit of ass, and there you go. And then in this movie, she's asked to go from that to, someone who is dealing with trauma, someone who is, longing to be a mother, somebody who is then like, hey, here's a machine gun, and now you have to be an action hero. And every single beat of that character development is believable. And again, Cameron is not really doing the heavy lifting with his script there. It's Sigourney Weaver. She's just that good. And we've been kind of texting back and forth, Brad, about like, we're going to talk about Sigourney Weaver, what makes her so special. And it's really hard to put a finger on because she does so many things well. And I think, honestly, that's kind of the answer, right? She can be whatever you need her to be in a movie. She's very slender and feminine, so she can play in like a romantic comedy. She's in the movie Working Girl. She does a fantastic job in that movie. But she's also like 6 feet tall. And so when she picks up like a shorter Paul Reiser and smashes him into a wall, you're like, oh, this is kind of believable. Like she's not super buff, but she's in very good shape. And just her sheer size, she really dominates the screen. And so when she's asked to do badass things, it's not because she's overpowering people with sheer brute force, but the fact that she is able to kind of balance like this physicality of, I am slender and traditionally feminine, but also like you can put a machine gun in my hand and it is never unbelievable. Like there are very few people in the history of cinema who could pull that off.
Yeah. And I think what I appreciate most about her is that she plays the protagonist role of what traditionally would be a male role with such integrity and calmness, and yet when she needs it, she has a massive range of emotion to draw upon as she is fighting to save this little girl that they've found, as she's dealing with the trauma of having survived a horror movie. Like, she has this ability to show incredible emotion and yet stay calm and cool-headed as she deals with the threats. I honestly, I was watching it with my buddy Steven, and he pointed out that it feels like Brie Larson tries to play a Ripley type character in Captain Marvel. And she just doesn't quite pull it off. She is all lifeless, all cool, all cold, and there's not enough emotion there to make you really like her as a character. Whereas Sigourney Weaver as Ripley, it's so easy to fall in love with her as the protagonist because of the emotional range that she has.
Well, and I think, honestly, that is a credit to Cameron as a screenwriter here, because he builds in those layers. And Brad, I don't know which version of this you saw. There was the theatrical version, and then in 1990, so 4 years after it came out, Cameron recut it to a director's cut. And here's the crazy thing about this director's cut. It's actually like a minute or so shorter than the theatrical cut.
Hey, let's go. Cameron just earned a few points in my book right there.
And the biggest difference is actually very small. Like, he just kind of tinkered with a few little things. But in the very early scenes where she's been rescued from her floating ship, the Nostromo, and she's rehabilitating, they tell her that she had she says something about her daughter. She had a daughter on Earth who was about to turn 11 years old. And she said that she told her daughter that she would be back before her 11th birthday. And that's when she asks how long she's been gone, and they tell her 57 years. And then they also tell her that in the intervening time span, her daughter's gotten old and she got cancer and died. And so that sets up the character of Ripley to have this maternal arc throughout the movie. So I don't know which version you saw. I watched the theatrical version.
I did as well.
If you don't remember, I was going to say, if you don't remember that line, then you didn't watch the director's cut. But even without that very obvious setup, you still get the idea of Ripley longing to have some, she has the maternal instinct, but also wanting to be a mother to somebody. And that's a theme that goes all through this movie, even to the final showdown with the alien queen. They very clearly have this thing in common, which is don't F with my daughter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's because of that they're able to get real, true emotion out of that character, because otherwise she does just kind of become this badass, military chick that she kind of becomes in the latter sequels to this movie. And Cameron does such a fantastic job of building those character arcs in. And I mean, I have to give him credit. Obviously, she acts it, but he built them in. And that's what's missing from so many protagonists, especially female protagonists in action films.
And I think that but on top of the fact that the child is there and it gives this maternal instinct, I think that Cameron does a really great job of using the camera to highlight the relationship between the two. And I think that Weaver as an actress just does a really great job of connecting with, the young female character of Newt. And they just have such good chemistry. And I think that the movie doesn't work without it because, there's a lot of other sci-fi movies that have tried to do that. And maybe it just works because this is an early example of it. But man, I love the way that Weaver interacts with Newt throughout the film. And especially in the scene where Paul Reiser has released the face hugger. What do you want to call it?
Yeah.
Into the room where they're sleeping, and she's beating on the window trying to get somebody's attention, and she realizes she can set off the fire alarm, and the way that she protects Newt in that scene is just really charming in the midst of a horrifying scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, I'm going to keep coming back to the fact, honestly, there are times where I kind of get conflated these two movies, Alien and Aliens, and I honestly forgot that the facehugger thing was in Aliens. I was thinking it was in the first one for some reason, and this movie never feels episodic, But it's also one of those things where, like, if you walked into the room and it was on and you came in at the right time, you're like, oh, they're going to do this thing now. And I'm going to sit here and watch it until the end of the movie because there's like 5 more incredible action set pieces from here. And like, you think that the movie's about to hit just a little bit of a lull, which is the calm before the storm of when the aliens arrive. And even in that moment, Cameron's like, nope. Like, I am not letting you relax at all. This movie is going to be tense AF until we're done. And that face hugger thing, that's the best jump scare in the whole movie. When that thing flies at her, when she like picks her head up over the bed and it flies at her. I jumped 11 feet. I have never jumped that far in my life. And I've seen this movie multiple times. It's so effective. And I'm going to keep coming back to like Cameron's ability to direct the hell out of a horror scene. We talked about it in Titanic. We talked about it in Avatar. We're going to talk about it obviously here because this is where this is like the fulfillment of that. But it's his script writing for this movie. The introduction of the character of Newt is out of nowhere. Like the last thing you are expecting to find, because we've spent an hour with only Ripley and only these military people. And there's this very extended sequence of them kind of like storming the complex. And it's really quiet because they don't want to disturb anything. And then they start getting a beep on the tracker. And you don't think there's going to be a human child introduced into this movie at the 1 hour mark. But once again, it's like something that Cameron throws in there and it takes the movie on a completely different trajectory. And it's incredible that he's able to do that with the movie like 5 or 6 times and still land the plane.
Yeah, and that's the key thing, right? That he's able to bring it to such a satisfying conclusion. There's the reconciliation between Ripley and the AI. There is an awesome final battle. There's the payoff of her being able to, use this heavy loader machinery in a really slow-paced battle that might have been the worst part of the movie. but it's just such a good payoff at the end of the film to see them going back into cryo and heading back to Earth.
Yeah, that fight scene at the end is probably the most iconic moment in the movie, which is her emerging from that elevator in the suit and saying, get away from her, you bitch. And like, it's an amazing moment. And then you have to watch like the fact that the hydraulics in this thing do not move quickly at all.
No.
And it's a good thing that alien queen is the least agile creature. Because it was very much a like,
Obi-Wan and Darth Vader.
I was thinking like in the old Godzilla movies where it was just like people in like zip up costumes that were like inflated trying to fight each other.
Mm-hmm.
Every once in a while at the minor league baseball stadium in Akron, they do like sumo wrestles in between innings. And it reminds me of that. I love
minor league baseball.
Dude, it's great.
Man.
They wear like the inflatable sumo costumes and they have to run at each other and they kind of like bounce and then they fall on the ground and they can't get up because they're just rolling. It reminded me of that a little bit. But honestly, it's still worth it for the emotional payoff.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that is probably the only misstep in the action sequences of the movie that really makes it feel a little bit old. Other than that, Bob, we've talked about this being a great and intense horror film. I think the action sequences in this are just incredible.
This is one of the best action movies of all time. And I have been trying to pin down how to talk about James Cameron action as opposed to anybody else. Our friend Patrick H. Willems has a great video about this. And even he kind of struggles to put into words like, what is it about Cameron versus his peers, right? It's certainly not as chaotic as Michael Bay or as kinetic as Michael Bay. He doesn't move the camera itself as much as Spielberg does within a scene. And you don't have like this sense of kind of static geography with him either. Like there are a lot of really rapid cuts with Cameron, like you would see with Michael Bay. But whereas with Michael Bay, it's disorienting and incoherent sometimes. With Cameron, you always have a sense of where you are. Like he establishes the geography, even if he's not, using a really long extended takes to do so or shots to do so. And I think Patrick Willems kind of hits it on the head in his video. He just says like, it's really direct. It's like there are no frills to his action scenes. They're just shot as matter-of-factly as possible. And there's not a lot of like over stylization to them. Even in Avatar, where everything is computer generated and they're pretty elaborate, like things flying and dragons and everything else. Like the way the scenes are shot is here's the information, do with it what you will. You know what I mean? And I actually really love that about Cameron because he trusts the audience to see what they're supposed to see. He's not spoon feeding anything to you, but he's also not calling a ton of attention to himself with the way he films it.
And I think the other thing for me is that he continues to use the little horror touches in the midst of the action scenes where you get a nice hard bit of action and then a short scene of them like creeping through the hallway, waiting for something else to ambush them. Mm-hmm. Or you have them stumble into the egg room, look around, see multiple aliens coming in, and see the alien queen like stare them down. And there's this standoff. And I think it's moments like that they help, they almost help give little beats to the action that give the audience just enough of a break to dive back into the next sequence.
There are a number of really great oh shit moments in this movie. And I remember, Brad, I didn't see this movie for the first time until I'd say, 2 years ago. It was right around the time, I remember this, we recorded the Warrior podcast because I was house sitting for somebody and I watched Warrior for the podcast and then I watched Aliens for the first time that night. And I remember I had the house all to myself so I could talk freely out loud. It was one of the few times in my life where a movie had a scene that I didn't know was coming and something happened in that scene and I was like, oh, like out loud. And it happened.
What scene was that?
So for me, it happened a couple times like this viewing, even though I knew it was coming. But the first really good one is right towards the end where Newt is kind of down in the sewer system. And then the alien like rises from behind her. I'm like, oh, that's not good. But the one that really gets me is when they're running and trying to get back to the ship at the end. And they realize that they've kind of stumbled into the nest and they see all the eggs. And you're like, oh, this is not good. And over the course of about 45 seconds, they slowly come to realize their surroundings and they turn around and you get the first shot of the alien queen. And it is so much bigger than any alien that you've seen across 4 hours of these movies now. And like, they're just looking up at it and it is slowly looking down at them. And I was just like, oh, like, how on earth do you get out of this scenario? It's such good filmmaking. There's so many great reveals in this movie and he really plays his cards close to the chest. It's a simple story, but he's always got something more, one more trick up his sleeve before he'll let you off the roller coaster.
Yeah, it's an incredibly kinetic movie that I think we have a lot more to say about it, Bob. But at this point, I need to drink some whiskey, man.
Let's do it. Let's drink this John J. Bowman. What do you say?
I'm ready, man. Let's do it.
All right, so today we are trying John J. Bowman single barrel bourbon whiskey. The J, period, I assume stands for Jingleheimer. That's
yes,
right.
Obviously,
I think that's pretty. We all know this, right? John Jingleheimer Bowman.
Yeah, this is actually named after. It was a family of Bowmans that fought in, I believe, the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And upon their retirement, they settled in Virginia and started a distillery.
Yeah, so the Bowman Distillery is a pretty big distillery that was bought out by Sazerac way back in like 2003, I think. They have an interesting production story, especially what we're drinking today. So this is, like I said, is a single barrel that they bottle at 100 proof. However, what is in the bottle was not made, I don't know what the word, it's not that I don't want to say distilled. It wasn't created in Virginia. It was not created at this distillery. It is a Buffalo Trace product. So Buffalo Trace has their new make that comes off the stills, what we would call White Dog, and it gets sent to the Bowman Distillery in Virginia. Now, what the rumor is that is twice distilled before it's sent to Virginia. And then they put it through their stills one more time. And their stills just kind of give it a little bit of a funk, a little bit of something different. And so then they can say that they distilled some of this, to some extent in Virginia. And it is aged totally on premises in Virginia. So even though it's made by Buffalo Trace, it's then kind of imported to Virginia, distilled once more. Brad, honestly, I don't know what more that imparts to this because I haven't tried it yet. It's sitting in front of me. I think it's a really interesting strategy. I don't quite understand why they're not just producing their own new make. And I'd have to read up more on the distillery for that. But, when we come into some of these whiskey reviews, it's not that we want to come in blind, but even me just saying the words Buffalo Trace made this right now may have tainted your opinion of this a little bit. And so, we want to judge what's in the glass and not necessarily rely on a history lesson or, to give context around, is this tasty or is it not tasty?
I was going to say, luckily for Mr. John Jingleheimer Bowman here, I already gave my scores. So I'm not going to knock down any points because if I'm being honest with you, Bob, this is a daggone good whiskey.
So, yeah, let's just jump right in, man. You've already scored this out. I'm trying it for the first time, and I just stuck my nose in the glass here. Now, again, I know that this was distilled by Buffalo Trace, but the nose on this smells remarkably similar to Eagle Rare, which used to be my favorite whiskey, like one of the whiskeys that got me into whiskey. There is that kind of patented Buffalo Trace oakiness to this. It's not like on the level of a Woodford Double Oak. It still has the sort of classic bourbon notes underlying all of it, but it smells like Eagle Rare. I honestly, I don't even know if I have many more notes to give on the nose here.
Yeah, for me, it was vanilla, peanut butter, a little bit of toffee. It's a very nice, not overwhelming in any way, not super complex nose. I gave it an 8 out of 10.
Yeah, there is a little bit of really strong fruitiness to this too that comes through right at the end, almost like a bright green apple kind of Granny Smith thing that isn't usually there on Eagle Rare for me. So it's a nice addition. I'm going to go ahead and give it an 8 as well, Brad.
Yeah, and then you get into the palate here. Once again, vanilla, peanut butter, and then for me, it almost turned into like a cream soda with a little bit of oak at the end. Once again, I have nothing to complain about here, Bob. It is a really pleasant palate, and I think 100 proof is just the right alcohol point for this. It just has enough of a kick that all of the flavors really pop. So I'll give it an 8.5 out of 10 on the flavor.
Brad, I don't know how to score this on the flavor, the palate. I thought I knew where this was going, and all through the tasting experience, I was like, yep, checking all those boxes, and then I swallowed it, and I felt like the flavor took a 180. Now, that's not to say it's bad. It's not to say it went from like, oh, this is really enjoyable or even predictable, and then it went to unpredictable. It just kind of like I went to swallow, and I thought, okay, the sweetness is going to hit me now. And it really never turned sweet. There's a very vague, mild sweetness on the tip of the palate, like at the tip of the tongue and the mid palate. And then you go to swallow, and it's like all oak and then kind of strong graininess for me. It almost turned a little bit sour at the end, and I wasn't expecting that at all. So I'm struggling with this a little bit. I took 2 sips just to make sure that it wasn't just because my palate wasn't acclimated, but I think that's kind of just what we're dealing with here. I'm struggling to remember when we did Eagle Rare the last time. I feel like I had some of these same complaints about Eagle Rare, and so maybe it's in line with that, but it's even more pronounced here. I'm not the world's biggest fan of this, dude. I think I'm going to give it a 6.5 on the flavor.
Man, Bob, that's surprising to me. For me, on the finish, it started to change. I got a little bit of oak, some leather, some pepper. The vanilla kept coming through for me. I gave it an 8 out of 10 on the finish. I'm really surprised that this kind of soured on you. I did not get any grainy sour notes on the finish at all. And it lingered for a long time after I drank it with some just really nice, pleasant, sweet notes.
Yeah, maybe it's not graininess. I'm taking a 3rd and 4th sip here. It almost gets, I don't know what the word is, man, like ashy. Like when you smell a really rank cigarette and like it almost leaves a flavor on your tongue. I kind of get that a little bit. It's just like really bitter on the end for me. So the finish is probably my least favorite part because it's like, hey, remember that ant that you don't like hanging out with that smokes too many Marlboros? Like, this is that. You can hear me kind of struggling with, the alcohol is very present on the palate and especially on the finish. Not my cup of tea, man. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10 again here.
We are going to be in vastly different places, Bob. On the balance, for me, it wasn't quite complex enough to really hit the upper echelons, but it was incredibly consistent and really tasty on my end. So I give it a 9 out of 10 on balance.
Wow. Yeah, I'm going to give it a 6 again here. And I suppose it's probably more balanced than that, but I don't enjoy where it goes. And so I'm kind of like, ugh, I'll follow you down whatever rabbit hole you're going down here, but it's going to be a 6 for me, dog. And then that takes us to value, Brad. And I don't know what this is currently selling at in the state of Ohio. Did you pull up the pricing list here?
I don't think it's actually sold in Ohio.
Oh, wow. I know they sell some products from the Bowman distillery in Ohio, but apparently not this single barrel.
Yeah, so this is actually not sold in the state of Ohio, Bob. The only one that they sell in Ohio is Bowman Brothers Small Batch.
Okay.
In Virginia and online, it seems to be for sale for $50.
Oh, okay. All right, so, I mean, here's the thing. It's like, do you like Buffalo Trace products? Here's one for you that is technically sold out of Virginia, but if, you can't find Elmer T. Lee, you can't find Eagle Rare, maybe you can find a bottle of this somewhere. And I imagine this is probably receiving the bump of Buffalo Trace. Like, people are probably seeking this out now that they know where it comes from. So at $50, even though I don't like it that much, it's probably more available and it's probably a comparable price point to something like an Eagle Rare. I don't think this is a terrible value, Brad. I'm going to give it a 7.5 on value.
Yeah, I think that at $50 to get a single barrel of this quality, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. I think it's a really solid value if you're able to find it.
Now, once again, I think we do need to give the clarification and the sort of reminder that this is a single barrel. This might not be exactly the flavor profile that you would get from barrel to barrel. Maybe, like I said, I think it's a little aggressive and a little too over oaked. We might not get that if we tried a different barrel of this product, but we can only really review what's in front of us here. I'm coming out, Brad, to a 34 out of 50. What are you coming to?
I think we might have the biggest gap we've ever had. I'm coming to a 42.5 out of 50.
Oh, wow. All right. So that brings us to a 76.5 out of 100. I just divided that by 3 instead of... or a 38.25 out of 50. I think it's a little high. You probably think that's a little low, but again, that's how math works. So, do you recommend...
Good job, Bob.
Thank you, sir. Do you recommend trying? Do you recommend buying?
Yeah, I'd say go for it. I think this is a really solid expression coming out of Bowman.
I really don't recommend this at all. However, if you're curious and if you like Buffalo Trace products, then yeah, get a pour at the bar. I don't know if I would immediately say yes, plunk down $50 for this. Although, again, with the caveat of if you like Buffalo Trace stuff, then you already know how hard it is to find Buffalo Trace stuff. So it might just be worth picking up the bottle of this because this is close enough. So if that's you, yes, buy a bottle. If you're curious, I think it's worth tasting at the bar. This will probably set you back. What do you think, Brad? $11 a pour?
Yeah, I would say 10 to 15.
Yeah.
Somewhere in that area.
Yeah, it's worth it. So go ahead and try it at the bar. And if you already know that you're going to like it because it's a Buffalo Trace product, then go ahead and grab a bottle if you can find it. But you're right, man. We are coming out to very different places on this whiskey.
Yeah, it's wild. I feel like our palates in general are somewhat similar, but hey, it's a beautiful thing when you find something to disagree on.
Well, hopefully we don't disagree too much on this movie. Let's get back into talking about aliens. What do you say?
Let's get to it. All right, everybody, that was John J. Bowman Single Barrel, a whiskey that was really, really incredible and absolutely nothing to complain about.
Yeah, not one thing. I feel about this whiskey the way that you feel about the movie Avatar.
Hey, man, I gave Avatar 7.5.
Yeah.
It was fine.
I kind of came out to the same place on this whiskey.
Yeah. Well, you know what is a 7.5 out of 10 on this podcast, Bob?
What's that, Brad?
2 facts and a falsehood.
I love that you are desperately grasping for anything to make a segue into 2 facts and a falsehood.
Hey, man, I'm just trying to stay away from the fact that you've been sucking it up lately.
Dude, I suck so bad at this season. I'm like actively trying to find ways to just kill this segment because it can't be good audio at this point.
Well, it's crazy because you started off like 0-6, and then you were like 8-7. And now I'm pretty sure you've lost like 4 in a row. So
it's really good audio if you're into like, Schadenfreude. Like if you really want to see Bob suffer, then this is the segment for you.
That's why I created it.
This is where Brad presents 3 items to me about the making of this film or something surrounding the film. All of them are presented as fact. I have to pick which one is the falsehood, and I'm clearly not very good at it. So, Brad, go ahead and hit me with your 3 supposed facts.
Fact number 1, Bill Paxton became annoyed with the constant breaks taken by the British production crew of Pinewood Studios and began playing pranks on them, his favorite of which was to add salt to their sugar, thus ruining their tea.
Huh.
Fact number 2, Bill Paxton continuously apologized to Carrie Henn, playing Newt, throughout the filming every time Hudson had to swear in front of her. Carrie later admitted that she didn't really mind, mainly because she did not know what any of the words meant. Fact number 3, this is one of the 2 films in which Michael Biehn and Bill Paxton play roles where they are on the same team. They're both Marines in this movie, and 4 years later, Navy SEALs. They are Navy SEALs together. In Tombstone, 7 years later, they are enemies. And they also appear together in The Terminator and The Lords of Discipline.
They definitely are in The Terminator together. I can say that much.
Oh, yeah.
That sounds true. I don't know. I'll say that's true. It could be false. Any of these could be false, and I'm probably going to pick the wrong one. I'm gravitating towards number 1 as the falsehood. And I'll tell you why. Because in our most recent episode, the falsehood also had something to do with tea, I think. It was the Celia Johnson I guess that wasn't our most recent episode. It was the Brief Encounter one 2 weeks ago. You said that Celia Johnson was real nervous and she wanted a specific kind of tea. And the tea was the falsehood. And so now I'm just like attuned that anytime I hear about tea, I'm like, the only thing Brad apparently knows about British people is that they drink tea. So if he's going to make something up, it's this one.
That's it.
Bill Paxton seemed like a good dude. So I'm going to say that number 2 is true just because I really like Bill Paxton and I want that to be true. So yeah, I'm going to say 1 is the falsehood just for kicks and giggles here.
Bob, you are great at breaking your streak today.
Hey!
You are correct. That was the falsehood.
I knew that your lack of knowledge about other cultures would benefit me someday.
That was it, man. The funny thing is, I honestly didn't even think about the tea thing from Brief Encounter.
See, now I can only get away with it once. Now you're going to, it's going to be top of mind whenever you're...
There's going to be a tea-related fact in every single week now.
All right, man. Well, I'm back on track. I'm just going to say I'm over 500 again. I know it's not true, but...
Wishful thinking.
All right, let's talk a little bit about James Cameron again here. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into trying to analyze this man in the next 2 weeks, because we're going to be looking at 2 movies that he made that are in direct relation to each other in Terminator and T2. And I guess before we start psychoanalyzing the guy or trying to find motivations or really putting on trial his self-confidence, I just want to say, the guy knocks it out of the park here. But we're coming off of Avatar, which is a movie that you famously are not a huge fan of, and your opinion of James Cameron had been colored by. And now we're throwing it back to a movie that is perhaps his most purely entertaining movie. And I just have to ask, man, has this rehabilitated his image for you any? And what themes or what consistencies are you seeing, if any?
I think the thing I really appreciate about Cameron is his ability to take really interesting characters and put them in insanely stressful situations and gives the audience an opportunity to just watch what comes out of those characters. And I think that you don't get that in Avatar. You get the stressful situation. You just don't get interesting characters. And that's the problem. However, there's a really great movie called Titanic. We haven't talked about Titanic at all, but I think that Aliens weirdly kind of has the same setup as Titanic. Like, you have these people who are looking to start a new life, and yet they're drawn into a wildly stressful, intense situation where they have to make life and death decisions. And Cameron, like you said earlier about his action sequences, he's just such a direct filmmaker that focuses the camera in really nice ways. He doesn't allow there to be a lot of extraneous movement. He doesn't allow for a lot of the other stuff to get in the way of just what are these characters going to do. And I think he does an incredible job with it in Titanic, and I think he does an incredible job with it here in Aliens.
Yeah, 100%, man. And honestly, I didn't want to move into let's make it a double so quickly here, but, I have to admit that for as much as I love Steven Spielberg and how he is unique and original and one of a kind, watching moments of this movie, I was like, oh man, did Spielberg lift a little bit of this for Jurassic Park?
Dude, when they're underneath the bed in the face grabber scene, I was like, oh, it's when the kids are in the Jeep.
Yeah.
Like, look, waiting for the Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Yeah, or the kitchen sequence with the velociraptors, right?
Yeah.
The moment for me is at the very end of the movie where the Queen is chasing them and Newt and Ripley get on the elevator and they cut back to the Queen as she figures out what an elevator is. And I'm like, oh, it's the velociraptors learning how to open a door. Like, it's the same thing. Yeah. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, wow, this is exactly what Jurassic Park is. It's an hour-long setup and then straight horror in action for the last hour. There is no letting up. You are on the edge of your seat. It's a thrill ride. And when you get off at the end, you are kind of physically exhausted. And like, man, I got my money's worth here. And I think that there is something to be said about the fact that Cameron did it 7 years earlier than Spielberg did. Right? I mean, I understand Spielberg had done this many times before and Jaws is a thing, but I think the direct comparison from this is Jurassic Park. And if I had to pick this to pair up with something, I think that would be the movie I would pick. And I do think Spielberg was at least somewhat influenced by the way that Cameron shot, cut, and paced this movie.
I think that's a really good pick, man. I think for me, I'm going to go a little bit more modern, and I'm going to pick the first John Wick movie. And for me, the reason is, I think that there's a similar pacing to John Wick where it starts off a little bit slow, but once you hit the midpoint of the movie, it just is non-stop action and just really honestly shot action sequences that don't have a lot of frill about them. And so, vastly different subject matter, vastly different eras of film history. But I think that there's enough in common here that I would want to go, if I was going to do a double feature of just great action films, I would go Aliens and then John Wick.
That is super interesting. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but I like that double feature. But at the end of the day, like, we're just going to be watching many, many really good action movies if we pair this up with something.
Exactly.
Here's my question to you before we give final scores. Is it unfair to pick a genre to categorize this movie under? Because, they always say, like, people always say that the first Alien is a horror masterpiece or a sci-fi masterpiece, and that this movie is an action masterpiece. And I understand that this is like, it's a great action movie. There is so much ass kicked in this movie. It is wonderful. It's also a really good sci-fi movie. Like the visualization of how the eggs come out of like the fallopian tubes of the alien. It's like, it's gross, but it is really effective world building. I learned a lot about alien reproduction in this movie, I gotta say.
Yeah, you sure did, Bob.
It's also a really effective horror movie. Like, there's a ton of jump scares, and I would say it probably leans a little bit more suspense than outright horror. But I'll tell you what, at the end of this movie, when there's the big reveal that the alien had been clinging to the bottom of the ship and it like spears the robot through the midsection and then picks him up and rips him in half in like half a second, I was like, oh, this is terrifying. Like I can't decide what category to put this in, and I almost feel like it would be unfair to pick one.
Action. It's an action movie.
All right. Okay.
I would call it an action horror.
Do you feel like the horror was effective in this movie?
Yes.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. I mean, especially just the raw grossness of this thing grabbing onto your face and implanting an embryo into you is just, like, oh my God, dude. Like, horror doesn't just have to be jump scares. It has to be ideas that literally make your skin crawl. And so if that doesn't do it for you, then I don't know what kind of horror you're looking for.
It has the benefit of the more horrific elements of the first movie working on its side, so that when this elite team drops into this planet and is trying to scope everything out, it's really suspenseful because you know what's coming and they don't. And that is like, it's terrifying, it's suspenseful, and so he really ramps up the suspense. But then once the horror elements start, they are genuinely scary too. And, you know, you just mentioned the idea of like the violation of the face hugger. We touched on this a little bit in the first Alien episode, but especially in a movie like this where Ripley truly becomes an action hero, I feel like this is kind of like Feminist Theory 101 movie. Like if you were introducing a group of college students in a film class to the idea of reading movies through a feminist lens, Aliens is like your prototype, right? I mean, it's movie in which the major theme of the film is motherhood, but bodily autonomy, right? Like this is, you line this movie up with like a Roe v. Wade thing and it's like, oh, okay, I understand what's going on here. Like it's an argument for a woman wanting to have autonomy over her body over against this thing that is trying to violate her. And so like, it's all there for the reading. But the great thing about this movie, it just works. Everything about this movie works. It works on a surface level. It works on a deeper level. It takes themes from the first movie and expands upon them. It takes some things from the first movie and says, F that, we're just going to shoot a bunch of things with machine guns. Like, it's just like, whatever your demographic, there is something in this movie for you. And like, is it a brutal movie at times? Yeah. Like it's a rated R movie from the 80s when the violence was much more violent than it is today. And like, I just got back from seeing the second Avatar movie last night. I went to a late showing. I'm really tired because I was out till almost 3 a.m. watching Avatar. But even today, like Avatar is a PG-13 movie with a lot of people getting machine gunned. And the violence is really kind of shocking for PG-13 because I'm so used to the bloodless, lifeless violence of the MCU now. But Cameron knows how to use violence. And like, this is just a reminder of that. I'm going on and on, Brad. I love this movie. I'll give it a final score. I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10. It's a really great movie.
Yeah, I'll give it a 9 out of 10, Bob. I think this is an incredible action movie near the top of what action movies have to offer. And it's largely because it mixes genres. So yeah, Cameron does incredible work here, man.
All right. So it's a 9.25 on average from us, but we would like to know what you think. Particularly, I hate to do this because people love both movies. If you had to pick between Alien and Aliens, I want to know what's your choice. So you can find us to tell us your choice on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Film Whiskey.
Or you can jump into the conversation on our Discord. Discord is an awesome place. It's a private server where only us, the fans of movies and whiskey, can talk to one another and engage on these subjects. So if you want to join the conversation, you can find the link to our Discord at the end of every single one of our show notes.
I got to ask you, man, which one's your preference?
Ooh, I think Aliens.
I think so too. I think I would revisit this more than the first Alien.
Yeah, I think so. I think the fact that they don't just do the horror bit, but they do just enough horror to make it horrifying, just enough action to make it thrilling. I really like what Cameron did here.
All right, next week we will throw it back a couple years from this to the movie that really announced James Cameron on the world stage, and that is 1984's Terminator. Join us for that and Brad's inevitably spicy takes next week. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.